What we want to do is look at the 5 common traps that exists around anything that makes you feel anxious, worried, or paranoid. So the first trap is something that makes our brain lose trust in us. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say because how is it possible that my brain can lose trust in me? It's my brain. But if you've ever been in a situation where you've done something or you thought you did something and then you find yourself doubting whether you really did it, that's a cue that the brain lost a hold of that trust in yourself. Can you relate with that at all? Often, how that trap happens is that whenever we are in any situation that causes us to doubt reality, and we then do something to check whether that doubt is important to actually take note of and look into it and explore, we start to teach the brain self-doubt. For example, if I say to myself, when I drink a warm glass of milk, it's fine because that's my experience. But one day I drank a warm glass of milk and it started making me vomit because I didn't realize it was spoiled. Now, every time I want to drink a glass of milk, that memory of that thing that happened starts to make me doubt whether it's okay or not okay. And because it was me who made that initial mistake, I'm thinking I can also still make the mistake. I want to check with other people. So the more I do things like double check things, the more I do things like check with other people or check with other systems to see whether what I'm thinking is right or wrong, the more I keep losing trust in myself. Do these examples help to make it make sense? So that's the first trap, losing trust in ourselves. And unfortunately, what happens with different anxieties is that we develop a lot of habits around reassurance, seeking, check-in, and all of that naturally just increases a sense of vulnerability. Because what you find is the more you seek those reassurances, the more you check, the more you feel you need to check. So the way we start to work against this trap is to start gradually reducing our reliance on these different types of strategies. If it's like you're checking something too much, to start reducing them. We'll talk about the reduction because there's another trap that's linked to that. So that's the first trap of the brain losing trust in us. The second trap is something I call the emotional sabotage. So in this situation, our emotions sabotage us. And that's because there is something going on. Because you can think of the brain like having a logical and an emotional part. And literally, there's a part of the brain that deals purely with the logical reasoning, and there's a part of the brain that deals with emotional reasoning. And usually they work together. However, often what happens is that when one gets too much in control, it pushes the other one out. So if your emotions are high, your logic disappears or just gets pushed down. And you can notice that in a situation where you just find you can't think clearly, you can't think straight because you're so uptight or anxious. And in that case, when our emotions are high, there's a higher chance that we believe what is not rational. And so afterwards, it's easy to start thinking, why did I think that? I know that's not rational because now our logic is returning. So we're able to challenge the thought a little bit. But in the height of the emotion, you're 100% believing the negative thought that was hooking you at that moment. Can you relate with this? And so, as an example, let's say you're someone who tends to get anxious about checking that the door is shut properly. So you go, you lock the door. At that moment that you shut the door and your anxiety spikes and you doubt, is the door shut properly? So you had to go and check again. And guess what? You check again. As you're checking again, trap one that we talked about is starting already because you are double checking. So you're losing trust in yourself. But because your emotions are still high, you may even take a picture of the door locked and still can't really believe the picture you're seeing. Because at that point in time, your logic is not there to help. This is all relatable. And the thing is, when you don't realize that trap exists, you will often fall prey to it because you'll be finding yourself getting high rates because you know that what you are believing is not logically correct, and yet you don't seem to be able to not stop yourself from reacting to it. But that's because the brain is going through the sabotage. So that's the second trap. Now, the third trap, in a way, takes these two traps and creates a habit out of them. So this is linked to something called neuroplasticity. The short story with it is that neuroscientists discovered that our brains are made up of pathways of neurons. So there's loads and loads of pathways of neurons that get developed in our brains. So the more we do things, the more those neurons get developed. And what happens with those pathways is that whenever you do any activity over and over again, you get thicker pathways, and those thicker pathways form into our habits. So let's say you're driving, you started learning to drive maybe 5 years ago. And at the beginning of learning to drive, it felt totally impossible. You thought you would never be able to do it. But after 5 years of driving now, you get into your car, you don't even think about driving. You can get in the car and drive to wherever you're going and didn't really think about the process of driving at all. That's because the pathway in the brain has gotten so thick and it's become second nature there. And this is how our habits form. So with the trap, what happens is anything you do around your OCD or anxiety, they tend to then form into a habitual pattern, which means the things you do that causes your brain to stop trusting you becomes a habit. And then the patterns you follow around being sabotaged by your emotions becomes a habit. So really what happens is you get triggered and all of a sudden that pathway lights up and those behaviors around your OCD or paranoia or anxiety just follow through. It's almost as if your body has its own mind. That's because of repeated patterns. The more we repeat certain patterns, the more they become habitual. But the good news of neuroplasticity is that we can rebuild new pathways, or we can take a pathway that's there already and break it and create another pathway from there by doing the behaviors we want to turn into habits. And why is that a good news? You may have wondered that it feels like the things that you're struggling with around the OCD or the anxiety, they feel like impossible to solve or to change because it feels like whatever you do, they just keep coming back. And the reason they keep coming back is because they've become habitual. And if you try to make a change without making that change habitual as well, the change will not stick. So what does that mean? It means that if you practice some of the strategies we learn just for 1 day or 2 days, it's not going to last. You got to practice those strategies over and over and over and over again until the point it becomes habitual. Then it will be effortless to stop the behaviors. Did that make sense? That brings me to the fourth trap. And the book Atomic Habits actually talks about this as well. But the idea here is often whenever we're trying to make a change, especially if it's a change with OCD or anxiety, one of the biggest reasons why it does not succeed is because we make too big a change. We take too big a bite of the problem. And that's partially because people don't really know what is a small step, what is a big step. So the step you take often tends to be too big. And because it's too big, it triggers your anxiety, triggers your emotions heavily. It's almost like you experience a traumatic experience with it, and that sets you back. So the thing there is that anything that we are not used to doing takes a lot of investment to try and do it straight away. Because you get traumatized like that, it's going to be hard to carry on and to maintain, because what you're going to be thinking of each time you want to do that thing is how much pain it cost you the last time. And so one of the things we need to start thinking of is using loads of baby steps. But one of the things that baby steps does, particularly for anxiety, is that it tiptoes around the fear centers of the brain whilst you are making progress with the problem that you're trying to deal with. So those are 4 traps so far. So the 5th one, this is perhaps one of the biggest ones. And it's the biggest because it causes us to get in the way of our healing process. You don't intend to do it, you eventually find yourself doing it. And that's because when you're trying to break through all these anxiety type problems, you can feel really frustrated by finding yourself back in it again. So you get frustrated with yourself, you feel negative towards yourself. But the more you get frustrated with yourself, what that does is to spike up your emotions, isn't it? And what did we say earlier about emotions being spiked? You lose rationality. So getting frustrated with yourself, being highly self-critical, whilst you're struggling or trying to break through these issues, it causes you to just struggle 100 times more to break through. So when you're trying to do this work, one of the best things you can do for yourself is be extremely compassionate with yourself. Because without that compassion, it's going to feel like you're climbing an uphill battle consistently as you're doing this work. Did that all make sense? So we'll touch on the 5 traps. And the thing is that as we are working through anxiety, if we are ensuring that we're dealing with these 5 traps that we're working through anxiety or OCD problems, you start finding that you're learning to cope better and things are actually working better in your favor.